Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 8, The Mayflower, Indentured Servitude, and Political Thought. When you get a chance, look at your old baby pictures, or your kids' baby pictures if you're a parent. Notice the faces of the past. They look so foreign sometimes. When looking at photos of my daughter Nora from several years back, I almost do a double take to make sure I have the same baby. But as I look closer, I see her face in a forgotten face. Her eyes and chubby cheeks are there, just different. I can see where she is today and what she was in the past, and I can piece together all our subtle changes as she sadly matures into what will eventually become a surly teenager. This is what this episode does for me as an historian. This is some of the first signs I see of America starting to move towards being America. Some good, some bad. We keep this up and our country's going to be shaving soon. The Mayflower. One of the most iconic images of American history is the pilgrim sitting around a turkey dinner with the natives. However, even the most intellectually feeble most likely can tell the truth is a bit different. In September 1620, a merchant ship called the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, a port on England's southern coast. Usually, the Mayflower's cargo was wine and dry goods. Still, on this trip, the ship carried passengers, 102 of them, all hoping to start a new life on the other side of the Atlantic. Nearly 40 of these passengers were Protestant separatists. They called themselves saints, who hoped to establish a new church in the New World. Today we often refer to those colonists who crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower as pilgrims. In 1608, a congregation of disgruntled English Protestants left England and moved to Leyden, a small town in Holland. These separatists did not want to pledge allegiance to the Church of England, which they believed was nearly as corrupt and idolatrous as the Catholic Church it had replaced, any longer. They were not the same as the Puritans, who had many of the same objections to the English Church but wanted to reform it from within. The separatists hoped that in Holland they'd be free to worship as they liked. In fact, these separatists, or saints as they called themselves, did find religious freedom in Holland. Still, they also found a secular life that was more difficult to navigate than they anticipated. For one thing, Dutch craft guilds excluded the migrants, so they were relegated to menial, low-paying jobs. Even worse was Holland's easygoing, cosmopolitan atmosphere, which proved alarmingly seductive to some of the saints' children. These young people were drawn away, separatist leader William Bradford wrote, by evil example into extravagance and dangerous courses. For the strict, devout separatist, this was the last straw. They decided to move again, this time to a place without government interference or worldly distraction, the New World across the Atlantic Ocean. First, the separatists needed to return to London to get organized. A prominent merchant agreed to advance the money for their journey. The Virginia Company gave them permission to establish a settlement, or plantation, on the east coast roughly between the Chesapeake Bay and the Hudson River. And the King of England gave them permission to leave the Church of England, provided they carry themselves peaceably. In August 1620, about 40 saints joined a much larger group of, comparatively, secular colonists, or strangers to the saints, and set sail for Southampton, England, with two merchant ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. However, the Speedwell began to leak almost immediately, and the vessel headed back to port in Plymouth. The travelers squeezed themselves and their belongings onto the Mayflower, a cargo ship about 80 feet long and 24 feet wide and capable of carrying 180 tons of cargo. the Mayflower set sail once again under the direction of Captain Christopher Jones. Because of the leaky Speedwell delay, the Mayflower had to cross the Atlantic at the height of the storm season. As a result, the journey was horribly unpleasant. Many of the passengers were so seasick they could scarcely get up, and the waves were so rough that one stranger was swept overboard. After 66 days, or roughly 2 miserable months at sea, the ship finally reached the New World. There, the Mayflower's passengers found an abandoned Indian village, but not much else. They also found that they were in the wrong place. Cape Cod was located at 42 degrees north latitude, well north of the Virginia Company's territory. Technically, the Mayflower colonists had no right to be there at all. To establish themselves as a legitimate colony, Plymouth, named after the English port in which they had departed, under these dubious circumstances, 41 of the saints and strangers drafted and signed a document that they called the Mayflower Compact. This compact promised to create a civil body politic governed by elected officials and just and equal laws. It also swore allegiance to the English king. It was the first document to establish self-government in the New World. This early attempt at democracy set the stage for future colonists seeking independence from the British. Colonists spent the first winter living on board the Mayflower. Only 53 passengers and half the crew survived. Women were particularly hard hit. Of the 19 women who had boarded the Mayflower, only 5 survived the cold New England winter, confined to the ship where disease and cold were rampant. The Mayflower sailed back to England in April 1621, and once the group moved ashore, the colonists faced even more challenges. During their first winter in America, more than half of the Plymouth colonists died from malnutrition, disease, and exposure to the harsh New England weather. In fact, without the area natives people, none of the colonists would likely have survived. An English-speaking Abenaki named Samoset helped the colonists form an alliance with the local Wampanoags, who taught them how to hunt local animals, gather shellfish, grow corn, beans, and squash. At the end of the next summer, the Plymouth colonists celebrated their first successful harvest with 3-day Thanksgiving festivals. We still commemorate this feast and remember it as the first Thanksgiving, though it did not occur on the 4th Thursday in November like it does today, but sometimes between late September and mid-November 1621. The colonists were outnumbered 2-1 by their guests. Attendee Edward Winslow noted that there were many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest of their greatest king Massasoit was some 90 men. Eventually, the Plymouth colonists were absorbed into the Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. Still, the Mayflower saints and their descendants remained convinced that they alone had been specifically chosen by God to act as a beacon for Christians worldwide. As one small candle may light 1,000, Bradford wrote, so the light here kindled hath shone to many, yea, in some sort, of our whole nation. New Sweden. It would be great if we could just tell history in a linear fashion, but to much chagrin, I have been unable to do so. History is messy and complicated, and we undoubtedly will have to jump around a bit. By the middle of the 17th century, the realm of Sweden had reached its greatest territorial extent. It was one of the great powers of Europe. Sweden then included Finland and Estonia and parts of modern Russia, Poland, Germany, and Latvia underneath King Gustavus Adolphus and later Christina, Queen of Sweden. The Swedes sought to expand their influence by creating a tobacco and fur trading colony to circumvent French and English merchants. The Swedish South Company was founded in 1626 with the mandate to establish colonies between Florida and Newfoundland for trade purposes, particularly along the Delaware River. The company sponsored 11 expeditions and 14 separate voyages to Delaware between 1638 and 1655. 2 did not survive. The first Swedish expedition to America sailed from the port of Gothenburg in late 1637. They passed Cape May in late March 1638 and anchored on March 29 at a rocky point on what is known as today as Swedes Landing. They built a fort in Wilmington, which they named Fort Christina after Queen Christina. In the following years, the area was settled by 600 Swedes and Finns, several Dutchmen, a few Germans, a Dane, and at least one Estonian. Peter Minuit became the first governor of the colony of New Sweden. He had been the third director of New Amsterdam, and he knew that the Dutch claimed the area south to the Delaware River and its bay. The Dutch, however, had pulled back their settlers from the spot after several years to concentrate on settlement on Manhattan Island. Governor Minuit landed on the west bank of the river and gathered the sachems of the Delawares. They held a conclave in Minuit's cabin. He persuaded them to sign deeds that he had prepared to solve any issue with the Dutch. The Swedes claimed that the purchased land included land on the west side of the South River. Delaware sachem Matatoon later claimed that the purchase only had as much land as was contained within the area marked by 6 trees. The rest of the land occupied by Swedes was stolen. Willem Keft objected to the Swedes' landing, but Minuit ignored him since he knew that the Dutch were militarily weak now. Minuit completed Fort Christina in 1638, then sailed for Stockholm to bring the second group of settlers. He made a detour in the Caribbean to pick up a shipment of tobacco to sell in Europe to make the voyage profitable. However, he died on this voyage during a hurricane at St. Christopher in the Caribbean. Sweden opened the Second Northern War in the Baltic by attacking the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Dutch sent an armed squadron of ships under the Director General Peter Stuyvesant to seize New Sweden. In 1655, the Dutch marched an army to the Delaware River, quickly capturing Fort Trinity and Fort Christina. The Swedish settlement was formally incorporated into Dutch New Netherlands on September 15, 1655. However, the Swedish and Finnish settlers were allowed local autonomy. They retained their own militia, religion, court, and lands. This lasted until the English conquest of New Netherlands launched on June 24, 1664. The Duke of York sold New Jersey to John Berkeley and George Carteret to become a proprietary colony, separate from the projected settlement of New York. The invasion began on August 29, 1664, with the capture of New Amsterdam and ended with the capture of Fort Casimir in Delaware in October. This took place at the beginning of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. New Sweden continued to exist unofficially, and some immigrations and expansions continued. The first settlement began with a Swedish log blockhouse located on Society Hill in Philadelphia in 1669. It was later used as a church until about 1700, when Gloria Dei, or the Old Swedes Church of Philadelphia, was built. New Sweden finally came to an end when its land was included in William Penn's charter for Pennsylvania on August 24, 1682. The most tremendous significance of New Sweden was the strong and lasting interest in America that the colony generated in Sweden. However, significant Swedish immigration did not occur until late in the 19th century. From 1870 to 1910, more than 1 million Swedes arrived in America, settling mainly in Minnesota and other upper Midwest states. Traces of New Sweden persist in the lower Delaware Valley, including Holy Trinity Church in Wilmington, Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Perhaps the most significant contribution of New Sweden to the New World's development is the traditional Finnish forest house building technique. The colonists of New Sweden brought the log cabin with them, which became such an icon of the American frontier that it is thought of as an American structure. Indentured servitude. Make sure you pay close attention to the next section. The concept of servitude and slavery are ultimately thrown around interchangeably. This does a disservice to the history of both systems. Indentured servitude in British America was the central labor system in British American colonies until it was eventually overcome by slavery. During its time, the plan was so prominent that more than half of all immigrants to British colonies south of New England were white servants. Nearly half of the total of white immigration to the 13 colonies came under indenture. By the beginning of the American Revolutionary War in 1775, only 2 to 3% of the colonial labor force were composed of indentured servants. Before the rise of indentured servitude, a great demand for labor existed in the colonies to help build settlements, farm crops, and serve as tradesmen. Still, many laborers in Europe could not afford the transatlantic crossing, costing roughly half a worker's annual wage. European financial institutions could not easily lend to the workers since there was no practical way to enforce a loan from across the Atlantic, rendering labor immobile via the Atlantic because of capital market imperfections. To address this imperfection, the Virginia Company would allow laborers to borrow against their future earnings at the Virginia Company for a fixed number of years to raise enough capital to pay for their voyage. Evidence shows this practice was used by 1609, only 2 years after founding the Virginia Company's original Jamestown settlement. However, this practice created a financial risk for the Virginia Company. If workers died or refused to work, the investment would be lost. By 1620, the Virginia Company switched to selling contracts of 100 servants to be disposed among the old planters, as soon as the servant reached the colonies. This minimized risk on its investment to the 2 to 3 months of transatlantic voyage. As the system gained in popularity, individual farmers and tradesmen would eventually begin investing in indentured servants. Indentures could not marry without their owner's permission, were subject to physical punishment, like many other young ordinary servants, and saw their obligation to labor enforced by the courts. To ensure uninterrupted work by the female servants, the law lengthened their indentured term if they became pregnant. But unlike slaves, servants were guaranteed to be eventually released from bondage. At the end of their time, they received a payment known as freedom dues and became free society members. One could buy and sell indentured servants' contracts, and the right to their labor would change hands, but not the person as a piece of property. Both male and female laborers could be subject to violence, occasionally even resulting in death. As slaves arrived in more significant number after 1700, white laborers in Virginia began a privileged stratum, assigned to lighter work and more skilled tasks. Runaways were regularly advertised in the newspapers. Rewards were offered, and both sheriffs and the public were enlisted to secure their return. The standard penalty in the North, not always rigorously enforced, was extra service of twice the time the master had lost, though whipping was also common. The causes behind its decline are contentious domain in economic history. The end of debtors' prisons may have created a limited commitment pitfall in which indentured servants could agree to contracts with ship captains and then refuse to sell themselves once they arrived in the colonies. Increased lobbying from immigrant aid societies led to increased regulation of the indentured labor market, further increasing the difficulty of enforcing contracts. With less ability to implement their contracts, demand for indentured servants may have fallen. However, most debtor prisons were still in service when indentured servitude disappeared. Many regulations on indentured servitude were put in place well before the practice's disappearance. The rise in the affordability of immigration reduced the immigrants' need for external financing in the form of indentures. The cost of immigration from Britain to the United States over the 18th century dropped from 50% per capita income to less than 10%. This attribute to higher levels of real income in Europe, a result of economic growth in the 17th century, and a sharp decline in transportation costs. Innovation had a substantial impact on the ease and the cost of passengers' transportation, reducing indentures' needs. The railroad made non-port cities a much cheaper destination for immigrants. The steamboat was not necessarily less expensive than older sailing technologies. Still, it made transatlantic travel much more manageable and comfortable, an attractive factor for high-income classes that could easily afford immigration without indentures. The British Navy's efforts against piracy also reduced transportation costs. Safer seas implied smaller crews, for there was no need to man weapons on board. And reduced insurance costs, ships were at lower risk of being captured. The composition of immigrants also shifted from single males towards entire families. Single males usually left their homes with little, if any, savings. Instead, families generally liquidated assets in Europe to finance their venture. The American Revolution severely limited immigration to the United States. Economic historians differ, however, on the long-term impact of the Revolution. The financial crisis that followed the war made long-term labor contracts unattractive. The territory of Hawaii was the last place in the United States to widely use indentured. By 1900, the practice had been abolished in the rest of the country and replaced by alternatives such as a credit ticket system used to transport Chinese laborers. Before U.S. annexation, indentures were widely used to transport Japanese contract workers to Hawaii for plantation work. In the Hawaiian Organic Act of 1900, the U.S. prohibited further use of indentures in the territory. It voided all such existing contracts, thus ending the practice. Housewives in the New World. The rest of this podcast will venture into the birth of many legal terms which you may not have realized were legal terms. Housewife refers to the married women's economic and cultural roles. Under legal rules of coverture, a wife had no separate legal identity. Everything she did was under her husband's authority. He controlled all the money, including any dowry or inheritance she might have brought to the marriage. She had certain legal rights to a share of the family's property when the husband died. She oversaw feeding, cleaning, medical care for everyone in the household, and supervising the servants. The housewife's domain, depending upon wealth, would also include cellars, pantries, brew houses, milk houses, wash houses, and batteries. She was responsible for the home manufacturing of clothing, candles, and foodstuff. At harvest time, she helped the menfolk gather the crops. She typically kept a vegetable garden and cared for the poultry and milked the cows. Husbands handled the other livestock and dogs. Mothers were responsible for the spiritual and civic well-being of her children. During the colonial era, the experiences of women varied greatly from colony to colony among different ethnic groups. In New England, for example, the Puritan settlers brought their religious beliefs with them to the New World, which dictated that a woman be subordinate to her husband and dedicate herself to rearing God-fearing children to the best of her ability. Among Puritan settlers in New England, wives rarely worked in the fields with their husbands. In German communities in Pennsylvania, however, many women worked in fields and stables. German and Dutch immigrants granted women more control over property, which was not permitted in the local English law. Unlike English colonial wives, German and Dutch wives owned their own clothes and other items. They were also given the ability to write wills disposing of the property brought into the marriage. Often women were taught to read to learn the Bible, but few were taught to write, as it was thought that there was no reason for a woman to know how to write. The colonial woman was expected to be subservient to her father until she married. At that point, she became subservient to her husband. Ministers often told their congregations that women were inferior to men and more inclined to sin and err. The typical woman in colonial America was expected to run a household and attend to domestic duties such as spinning, sewing, preserving food, animal husbandry, cooking, cleaning, and raising children. Families tended to be large, and childbearing could be dangerous before advancements in medicine and healthcare. A responsible housewife was supposed to be resourceful with her family's budget, which led to manufactured goods being a vital contribution to a household's success. Home manufactured goods, such as dairy products and textiles, were usually created by women. In contrast, the women's husband was the owner of the goods and received whatever money they sold for. When necessary, it was the colonial housewife's responsibility to help her husband in agriculture and artisanal endeavors. Mothers were responsible for the spiritual and civic well-being of their children. In the colonial era, the commonly held idea was that excellent housewives would raise good children who would become upstanding citizens in the community. As a wife, the woman was to be dutiful, obedient, faithful, and subservient to her husband. Legal statutes and societal norms allowed husbands to exert power over their wives, resulting in violent circumstances. Some housewives were able to file for divorce, but these instances were not the norm. 17th century literature. A lot of thought and belief systems that we hold today are birthed during this era of American history. Because of the massive immigration to New England in the 1630s, the articulation of Puritan ideals, and the early establishment of a college and printing press in Cambridge, the British colonies have often been regarded as the center of early American literature. However, the first European settlements in North America have been founded elsewhere many years earlier. Towns older than Boston include the Spanish settlements of St. Augustine and Santa Fe, the Dutch settlements of Albany and New Amsterdam, and the English colony of Jamestown in present-day Virginia. During the colonial period, the printing press was active in many areas, from Cambridge and Boston to New York, Philadelphia, and Annapolis. The dominance of the English language was not inevitable. The first item printed in Pennsylvania was in German. It was the most massive book published in any of the colonies before the American Revolution. Spanish and French had two of the most vital colonial literary traditions in the areas that now comprise the United States. Early American literature discussions commonly include texts by Samuel de Champlain along English language texts by Thomas Harriot and John Smith. Moreover, we are now aware of the wealth of oral literary traditions existing on the continent among the numerous different Native American groups. However, political events would eventually make English the main language of the colonials at large, as well as the literary language of choice. For instance, when the English conquered New Amsterdam in 1664, they renamed it New York. They changed the administrative language from Dutch to English. From 1696 to 1700, only about 250 separate items were issued from the American colonies' major printing presses. This is a small number compared to the output of printers in London at the time. London printers published materials written by New England authors, so American literature was more extensive than was published in North America. However, printing was established in the American colonies before it was allowed in most of England. In England, restrictive laws had long confined printing to 4 locations. The government could monitor what has been published: London, York, Oxford, and Cambridge. Because of this, the colonies ventured into the modern world earlier than their provincial English counterparts. Back then, some of the American literature was pamphlets and writings extolling the colony's benefits to both a European and colonist audience. Captain John Smith can be considered the first American author with his work, A True Relation of Such Occurrences and Accidents of Note as Hath Happened in Virginia. written in 1608, and The General Histories of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, written in 1624. The religious disputes that prompted settlement in America were important topics of early American literature. A journal written by John Winthrop, The History of New England, discussed the Massachusetts Bay Colony's religious foundations. Edward Winslow also recorded a diary of his first years after the Mayflower's arrival. A Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts, was a sermon preached on the flagship of Winthrop's fleet in 1630. This work outlined the ideal society that he and other separatists would build to realize a Puritan utopia. Other religious writers included Increase Mather and William Bradford, author of the journal published as A History of Plymouth Plantations, 1620 to 1647. Others like Roger Williams and Nathaniel Ward more fiercely argued state and church separation. Like Thomas Morton, still, others cared little for the church. Morton's The New English Canaan mocked the religious settlers and declared that the Native Americans were better people than the British. Puritan poetry was highly religious. One of the earliest books of poetry published was the Bay Psalm Book, a set of translations of the biblical Psalms. However, the translator's intention was not to create a literature, but to create hymns that could be used in worship. Among lyric poets, the most important figures are Anne Bradstreet, who wrote personal poems about her family and home life. Pastor Edward Taylor, whose best poems, the preparatory meditations, were written to him prepare for leading worship, and Michael Wigglesworth, actual name, whose best-selling poem, The Day of Doom, describes the time of judgment. You can't make some of this stuff up, people. Of the second generation New England settlers, Cotton Mather stands out as a theologian and historian who wrote the colony's history with a view of God's activity in their midst and to connecting the Puritan leaders with the great heroes of the Christian faith. His best-known works include Magnalia Christi Americana, The Wonders of the Invisible World, and the Biblia Americana. (17th-century American philosophy). Researching this topic was very exciting to me. I see a great deal of our political belief system in the infancy of thought in the New World. The American philosophical tradition began at the time of the European colonization of the New World. The Puritans' arrival in New England set the earliest American philosophy into religious practice. There was also an emphasis on the relationship between the individual and the community. In 1634, a group of Puritans and others dissatisfied with the rate of Anglican reforms sought to establish an ecclesiastical society subject to their own rules and regulations. The Massachusetts General Court granted the permission to settle cities of Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford. Ownership of the land was called into dispute by the English holders of the Warwick Patent of 1631. The Massachusetts General Court established the March Commission to mediate the conflict and named Roger Rudloe. The commission called 8 magistrates from the Connecticut towns to implement a legal system. The March Commission expired in March 1636, after which the settlers continued to self-govern. On May 29, 1638, Ludlow wrote to Massachusetts Governor Winthrop that the colonists wanted to, quote, unite ourselves to walk and lie peaceably and lovingly together, end quote. Ludlow and other principals drafted the fundamental orders adopted on January 14, 1639, and established Connecticut as a self-rule colony. Major John Mason was a magistrate and is credited with being one of the writers of this document. There is no record of the debates or proceedings of the drafting or enactment of the fundamental orders. It is postulated that the framers wished to remain anonymous because England was watchful and suspicious of this vigorous infant colony, and the commission from Massachusetts had expired. The orders were transcribed into official colony records by the colony secretary Thomas Wells. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is a short document, but contains some principles later applied to creating the United States government. Government is based on the rights of an individual, and the order spells out some of those rights and how they are ensured by the government. It provides that all free men share in electing their magistrate, and uses secret paper ballots. It states the powers of the government and some limits within which that power is exercised. In one sense, the fundamental orders were replaced by a royal charter in 1662. However, the charter's primary outline was written in Connecticut and embodied the order's rights and mechanics. It was carried to England by Governor John Winthrop and basically approved by the British King, Charles II. The colonists generally viewed the charter as a continuation of their fundamental orders. Later, the charter oak got its name when that charter was taken from Jeremy Adams' tavern and supposedly hidden in an oak tree, rather than being surrendered to the agents of James II. He intended to annex Connecticut and the more centralized dominion of New England. Today, the order's individual rights, with others added over the years, are still included as a Declaration of Rights in the first article of the current Connecticut Constitution, adapted in 1965. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties was the first legal code established in New England, compiled by Puritan minister Nathaniel Ward. The laws were established by Massachusetts General Court in 1641. The Body of Liberties begins by establishing the General Court's exclusive right to legislate and dictate the countenance of authority. In 1684, King Charles II revoked the Body of Liberties and reinstated English law over the Commonwealth. King James II established the Massachusetts colony. The Body of Liberty took effect and remained so until it was replaced by the 1691 Provincial Charter. Though towns such as Durham and Watertown had already been established, the Body of Liberties recognized boards of selectmen for the first time. The Body of Liberties was one of the earliest protections of individual rights in America. Unlike many of the English sources of the time, the Body of Liberties was expressed in many of their grants and far more supportive of individual rights. Despite these grants, the rights were modifiable by the General Court. To varying degrees, the document contained rights that would later be included in the Bill of Rights. Many other rights are now considered fundamental components of procedural due process, such as rights to notice and hearing before the court. The requests also contained in the Bill of Rights included freedom of speech, a right against uncompensated takings, a right to bail, a right to a jury trial, a right against cruel and unusual punishments, and a right against double jeopardy. In addition to those, the Body of Liberties also contained other individual rights, including a prohibition of compulsory draft except for territorial defense, a ban on monopolies, quote, "No monopoly shall be granted or allowed amongst us, but of such new inventions that are profitable to this country, and that for a short time," end quote. A prohibition of estate tax, the freedom of all householders to fishing and fowling on public land, and a declaration that a married woman should be, quote, "free from bodily correction or stripes by her husband," end quote. The Liberties Body also contained regulations against tyranny or cruelty towards domestic animals, which were the first American modern animal protection laws. Some of the liberties legislated are explicitly cited as originating from biblical sources, while many of the freedoms established still exist in both law and practice in the Commonwealth today. Some do not. The justification for slavery of Africans in passage 91 of the Body of Liberties was likely based on the interpretation of scriptural passages of the New Testament, such as Ephesians 6:5 and Titus 2:9. Liberties were only extended to Caucasian Northern Europeans, mainly Protestant Christian men. Native Americans taken prisoner during wars were shipped to the West Indies to be slaves on the sugarcane plantations. Returning ships brought African-born and descended slaves to New England. Slavery was legal in Massachusetts from 1641 to 1780, ending with the passage of Massachusetts Constitution. Thinkers such as John Winthrop emphasized public life over the private. Winthrop's reference to the, quote, city upon a hill in a model of Christian charity has become an enduring symbol in America's political discourse. Many American politicians have cited him in their writings or speeches, going back to revolutionary times. Winthrop's reputation suffered in the late 19th and early 20th century when critics pointed out the negative aspects of the Puritan rule and leading to modern assessments of him as a lost founding father. Winthrop is at once a significant founding father of America's best and worst impulses, with his calls for charity and public participation offset by rigid intolerance, exclusionism, and judgmentalism. Winthrop gave a speech to the General Court in July 1645, stating that there are two kinds of liberty: natural liberty to do as one wished, evil as well as good, liberty that he believed should be restrained, and the civil right to do good. Winthrop strongly thought that the civil freedom was the proper end and object of authority, meaning that the government's duty to be selfless for the people and promote justice instead of promoting the general welfare. He supported this point of view by his actions, such as when he passed laws requiring the heads of households to make sure their children and servants received a proper education and teacher support from public funds. Winthrop's actions were for the colony's unity because he believed that nothing was more crucial for settlement than working as a single unit that wouldn't be split by any force. Many modern politicians refer to Winthrop's writings in their speeches. People as diverse as John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Michael Dukakis, and Sarah Palin. Ronald Reagan described Winthrop as an early freedom man who came to America looking for a home that would be free. Roger Williams was a Puritan minister, theologian, and author who founded Providence Plantations, which became the colony of Rhode Island. He was a staunch advocate of religious freedom, separation of church and state, and fair dealings with Native Americans. He was one of the first abolitionists. Williams was expelled by the Puritan leaders from Massachusetts Bay Colony for spreading, quote, new and dangerous ideas, end quote. And he established the plantation of Providence in 1636 as a refuge offering for what he called liberty of conscience. Williams was a staunch advocate of separation of church and state. He was convinced that the civil government had no basis for meddling in matters of religious belief. He declared that the state should concern itself only with civil order issues, not with the spiritual devotion. He rejected any attempt by civil authorities to enforce the first table of the Ten Commandments, those commandments that dealt with individual relationship and with the belief in God. Williams believed that the state must confine itself to the commandments dealing with people's relations: murder, theft, adultery, lying, and honoring parents. He wrote of a, quote, hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, end quote. Thomas Jefferson used the metaphor in his letter to Danbury Baptists in 1801. Williams considered it forced worship if the state attempted to promote any religious idea or practice, and he declared, quote, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils, end quote. He considered Constantine the Great to be a worse enemy to Christianity than Nero because the subsequent state involvement in religious matters corrupted Christianity and led to the Christian church's death. He described the state's attempt to pass laws concerning an individual's religious beliefs as, quote, rape of the soul, end quote, and spoke of the, quote, oceans of blood, quote, shed because of trying to command conformity. The moral principles in the structures ought to inform the civil magistrates, he believed. Still, he observed that well-ordered, just, and civil governments existed even where Christianity was not present. Thus, all governments had to maintain civil order and justice. Still, Williams decided that none had a warrant to promote or repress any religious views. Most of his contemporaries criticized his ideas as a prescription for chaos and anarchy. The vast majority believed that each nation must have its national church and could require that dissenters conform. Williams' defense of the Native Americans, his accusations that Puritans had reproduced the evils of the Anglican Church, and his insistence that England pays the Indians for their land all put him at the center of many political debates during his life. He was considered an important historical figure of religious liberty at the time of American independence, and he was a key influence on the Founding Fathers' thinking. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.